to move in here. Okay, so we are really fortunate and excited to have you here, Nick, today to give a talk on your current work and I think some of your previous research as well in your PhD. So as Christina already mentioned, Nick is visiting us from Durham University, where he's a Bridging Fellow in Medical Humanities. He's part of the Discovery Research Platform. We had Angela Woods, who's the director of the platform, visiting, I think, a year or two back, giving a talk here. So Nick is here for a few weeks, so you can also catch him and discuss his work even after today, but we'll have sandwiches once we finish as usual, so there'll also be a chance to chat more there. So Rick is a recent PhD in comparative literature from the University of St Andrews in Scotland and is currently working on his first monograph, so that's really exciting. In his work he's focused on neurodiversity and the contemporary, and he's doing now also some fascinating interdisciplinary work on OCD, exploring the dynamics of culture and OCD through the lens of literature and other narrative forms. And I think we'll learn much more about this today. So I'm really happy we can welcome you here, Nick, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the very warm welcome that I've received in the past week. It's an honor to be here and to participate in this very rich seminar series. I just hope I'll be able to keep you entertained for the next 40-45 minutes or so. So as Meta was saying, I'm Nick, I come from Durham. My work primarily is on neurodiversity, comparative literature, and epistemologies of what the contemporary is, which I look at primarily from the perspective of time studies. Today's talk, it's about speculative temporalities. It's primarily about OCD and how we can develop a new way of looking at lived temporality in OCD. Some of you may work or may have worked on OCD before. Some of you may know the Postcontemporary because of its very tight links to the contemporary, and a lot of quite relevant theorizations of the contemporary have actually come from this university and the School of Communications and Culture. What I would like to present to you today are some preliminary findings of what I've been doing recently. But I would like to be clear that they are not the finished product of my research. I would also like to say that quite recently I've started to think about how I do research in terms of provocations. And I really would like this to be an opportunity to provocatively bring together two different topics that have been discussed individually, separately, and just try and bring them together and see what this new pairing might generate, see if there's any benefits at all or not. I will start with a couple of terminological clarifications, then I will move to have a look at how models of time in OCD have been discussed so far, how they relate to larger models of thinking time today, and then I will turn to the post-contemporary time complex and see what the post-contemporary time complex can tell us, if anything, about the experience of time in OCD. So before I dive into this topic, I feel it's my duty as a literary scholar to start with a few terms, and a few terms that I will come back to during my talk. Right, the first one is OCD, of course. This is a talk about OCD. It's not a talk about subtypes of OCD. So you may know that there is a lot of subclassifications of OCD, some of which have a clinical meaning, some of which are not medically recognized. I'm thinking about pedophilia OCD, homosexuality OCD. This is not a talk about any of these subtypes. When I'm thinking of OCD, I'm referring to it as a sort of disease entity, as the same way that you might think about dementia. So it's something whose symptoms roughly recur in all of these subtypes. And usually when we think about OCD, we think about someone living with obsessive thoughts, experiencing compulsive behaviors, and all of this is usually attached to a high level of anxiety. I will also be thinking and approaching OCD as a sort of biocultural category. And what I mean by this is that some of the symptoms of OCD may recur across history, in a sense be transhistorical. They remain the same across time. You have the obsessive thoughts, you have the compulsive behaviors. But some of the ways they manifest could actually change, and they may be dependent and related to the culture of reference of the person experiencing OCD. So there's something that stays the same and something that changes. I would also say that I will be speaking of OCD as a short term for obsessive-compulsive disorder. But in my research, I sometimes take issue with the idea that OCD is necessarily a disorder. So it can be disabling, it can become a disabling condition, but I often find value in my work to stress how it can better be seen as a neurodivergent condition. So in the sense of belonging to what is considered to be neurodiversity, the neurodiversity paradigm. And what this wants to highlight is the idea that OCD can be also a valuable form of human diversity. The idea that there is one right or correct type of brain or mind is just a culturally constructed fiction, the same way that some people might argue there is one right gender or one right ethnicity. And also that the dynamics that manifest with regard to OCD, the social dynamics, are often those manifesting in regards to other minority. So this includes dynamics of power inequalities, where OCD is often dismissed, or it could be also those dynamics by which, when we embrace OCD, it can actually be a source of creative potential. And this is a lens that I think applies quite well to my talk today, in the sense that, as you will see, it's a very speculative talk. And what I'm trying to do here is a bit of creative work. I'm trying to bring together the experience with OCD with a model of time that originated within a very different discourse, a socio-philosophical discourse, and really see what happens when we bring the two together. And if it can help us retell the obsessive-compulsive experience of time as it is lived by people with lived experience and recounted in their narratives in a more truthful way. And finally, time. Time is perhaps the simplest but most complex of the terms that I'll be referring today. And I think I should say that when I will be speaking about time, I will be speaking of time in terms of its tripartite structure, past, present, and future. I think this is quite a limiting way of thinking about time, in the sense that it follows the way of structuring time and perceiving time of the predominant neurotype of neurotypical people. I also recognize that when speaking of what I will be speaking today, this is perhaps the best vocabulary available to me today. But my hope remains that this discussion and other discussions about time, the contemporary OCD, can also help us generate a new vocabulary, a more accurate vocabulary to express neurodivergent and more neuroinclusive experiences of time. Finally, I will be referring to the experience of time in OCD primarily from a non-clinical perspective. So if I ever make references to clinical studies, is just as that, as references. But I'm not as interested in the neurobiological processes behind the experience of time as much as how OCD is recounted, and the experience of time of OCD is recounted by people with lived experience as they communicate it to us. So the question today is, how does time work in OCD? If you search online and if you Google OCD and time, you'll come up with a bunch of either prescriptive articles that tell you how to control time during OCD, regain control today, or afraid of time passing, strategies for OCD and time management. Some of these are quite questionable entries, I'd say. Or scholarship on OCD and memory mixing. So that's an article titled Obsessive-compulsive disorder and memory mixing in temporal comparison, is implicit learning the missing link? And I find it very interesting that Google, or whichever algorithm you use, predilects this very curated mix of prescriptive but questionable entries or scientific scholarship on the topic, but you don't find anything about the lived experience of time in OCD, which is what I would like to look at today. You will also find entries on time OCD, which is another subtype of OCD, which is characterized by an irrational fear of time passing, but you won't find anything on lived time. And to my knowledge, but I should say that I'm pretty new to the field because I've only been researching OCD seriously for just over a year now. There's only one academic non-clinical article that tackles this problem. And it's by Drew McEwen. It was published last year in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. It's called Toward an Obsessive-Compulsive Mad Time. It's also another article that you will not easily find indexed on Google, but if you look it up on Google Scholar, you'll easily find it on page 2. So, McEwen is very interested in the ways that obsessive-compulsive time is lived and then narrativized, communicated to us. And she explains, and I quote, "Acute experiences of obsessive-compulsive distress both speed up time in the frantic repetition of the obsession and compulsion and cause delays and slowed progression through the necessary activities of daily life. Both inwardly fast and outwardly slow, experiences of obsessions and compulsions, medicalized as OCD, present a paradoxical temporality marked by repetition in an ongoing present in the fear of a feared future." What McEwen does in the article, she uses her lived experience and an analysis of a couple of novels and literary texts to suggest that OCD compels one to stay locked in the present. And you stay locked in the present because you constantly fear a future of which you fear. In moments of obsessive-compulsive distress, she says, it's almost as if the present dilates, extends, and take over any attempt to move past, to move towards a better future. Any attempt to move past it makes the cycle start all over again. She says, despite their speed, my OCD rituals on this and many other days were a time-consuming activity, which delayed my departure and made me late for my job. The ongoing engagement with the present, represented by the compulsive behavior propelled by obsessive thoughts, the fear is a future of danger and uncertainty. Now, it doesn't really matter whether the way that McEwen acts is logical or illogical. What matters, she says, it's this temporal positionality. She feels that she needs to be in the present because in the present she can take action, she can check, she can recheck, and she can find some sort of solace from the anxiety that grips her. But in so doing, she's still delaying this future. The future is still not coming up to her. Now, as someone with OCD myself, I find that McEwen's account resonates quite deeply also with my own experience of OCD. But there's two things that I think it's worth pointing out about her approach. The first one is that her idea of what an obsessive-compulsive mad time can be like takes compulsions as its starting point, emphasizing how the repeated actions of OCD extend the present. So we've seen that she says the ongoing engagement with the present, represented by the compulsive behavior propelled by obsessive thoughts, defers a future of danger and uncertainty. She also says, in the fear of the future disaster that awaited if I didn't act on a compulsion, I repeated the preventive action, even as the sense of completion and avoidance of the future harm remained elusive. So the present is perceived as expanded because it is marked by the repetition of the compulsive act. The second thing about her model is that because of this, she considered the experience of time in OCD as deeply rooted in the present. And her model, in a very uncanny way, reminds me of another that time scholars have used now for quite a while to discuss the experience of time in the world that we live in. Before I draw a comparison between the two, I think it's important that I clarify that I do not see in any way OCD as a manifestation of modernity or of the world that we live in, as a few scholars have said. I don't think that it is productive or constructive to think of OCD as a category that pathologizes thoughts and actions which are deemed to be excessive just by the society. I think it's something that goes beyond that. And I also don't believe that there's necessarily clear links between how time is lived in OCD and how time is lived by the world at large. But if OCD is to be treated as a biocultural marker, as a biocultural category, and some of the ways that obsessions and compulsions manifest are dependent on the culture of reference of the person, then I think I don't see any harm in calling on existing epistemologies of time to consider what these implications could be for OCD and explore what they can tell us more about McEwen's tentative model. Also, time and how we think of time is clearly a product of the time we live in. Apologies for the pun. And I believe that largely theorized ways of thinking about time can maybe tell us something about less or under-theorized ways of living time. So all of this is to say that McEwen's model reminds me of another one developed by time scholars to suggest how today we live in a world that has lost the drive towards futurity. And we live in a world which is characterized and it's been replaced by an expansion of the present. So they say that we live in a world of a sort of presentist present, in the sense that present is all there is. It expands in all directions. Art historian Boris Groys says exactly this, and I quote, "The present has ceased to be a point of transition from the past to the future, becoming instead a site of the permanent rewriting of both past and future, of constant proliferations of historical narratives beyond any individual grasp or control." The traditional category of the present and what the present is has turned into presentism, the idea that the present has now become omnipresent. And in this regime of time that time scholars say we live today, the present has become the privileged category of time according to which both the past and the futures are conceived. So the present is expanding and future and past are defined by it. If anything, future and past are used to valorize the present, to valorize what's considered to be the immediate. There is no longer a vector of directionality that leads us towards the future, and ideas of an historical time, or again, a possible future, are suspended altogether. We live in a present that constantly repeats itself without leading anywhere. Now, Professor Lund from the School of Communication and Culture here in Horus, discussing Groys, has said exactly this. The present ways of articulating past, present, and future not only make a present different from previous presents, but they testify to a change in our experience of time, an experience of an ever-expanding, perpetual present, which in a certain sense can be seen as a time relation that has no temporal horizon other than itself. So the repetition, the proliferations, the never-ending reproduction suggested by Groys and others, there is also François Hartog that speaks about this, remind me of what McEwen is describing in her experience of time in OCD. A present that is a present because it doesn't or it cannot lead to a future anymore. In both instances, the present exists at the expense of all non-present temporalities, be it the past or the future. Unlike McEwen, Groith and Lund takes this one step further, and they consider what the implications of this potential regime of temporality might be. And they say that if the categories of past and future stop existing in a sense, and then the present is all there is, then nothing is present any longer. So we live in a crisis of time because we cannot define the present anymore with respect to what is not the present. Past and future don't exist. If they do, as I said, they only valorize the immediate. Now, I don't disagree with this perspective in the sense that I don't disagree that the person with OCD feels that they might exist in a perpetual, ongoing present where they can take action, where they can check and recheck. I also agree with OCD scholars that OCD manifests in a sort of cycle, and it's very difficult to escape this cycle because you have your obsessive thoughts, you do your compulsive action, and if you try to resist that compulsive action, no matter what your willpower is, your brain will send more catastrophic messages to you that will make you want to do that compulsive action. So I don't disagree with any of this. There is an OCD memoir by Jeff Bell that is intentionally called Rewind, Replay, and Repeat because of how hard it is to escape the cycle. However, I think, and this is perhaps where my perspective differs from that of McEwen, I would like to propose a complementary, not necessarily altogether different, model to how time can be seen to work in OCD. It seems to me that the very structure of obsessive-compulsive disorder should not really start from the compulsion, but should take the obsession as its starting point, because the obsession is what triggers the compulsion. But most crucially, I argue that the experience of obsessions is not rooted in the present. It exists outside of the present altogether. And I want to give you a couple examples from my own experience with OCD, believing, like med theorist Scheidegger Fay says, that if I'm going to explore and theorize madness, I must do so in the first person and speak from a position of lived experience. So something that sometimes happens to me is that when I leave the house to go to work, I feel that I have to check that the oven is off. I need to smell for any gas leak, and then I need to take photos to make sure that everything is okay. And then before going to bed, I will then recheck these photos to make sure that I was in fact right, that everything was okay. And the thought that constantly triggers these actions is that I may have left the oven on, that I may die during the night, or the whole place may burn down, and then I may be held accountable, I may be left without a place to live in, and I may be asked to pay an outrageous sum of money to pay for all the costs. So I take picture because that's my way of having time-stamped evidence that I wasn't responsible for any of that. Another example may be whenever I speak to somebody who I really admire, somebody that I really look up to. After our conversation, I have to relive it in my head. I have to check that it went well, all the participants' role in the conversation. And the thought triggering this is that I need to make sure that I didn't say anything bad, something that may compromise or have already compromised, unknown to me, my relationship to that person who may want to end their friendship or their work relationship with me. So, for example, when I was invited by a colleague to go to the pub after an event they had organized and I had a deadline so I couldn't do it, I then had to relive his response to me over and over in my head, and it was a very nice response. It was like, you know where to find us if you change your mind. but I had to relive it constantly and I had to perform a number of compulsive actions that somehow put an end to the anxiety that had gripped me for quite some time by then. And I'm not saying that my experiences are unique, because McEwen herself says about her checking routine on a morning of October 2021. Before leaving for the bus, I touched my bag, my laptop, the novel I would be teaching, my notebook and my pen. I then repeated this process 4 times. Throughout, I tried to make my anxious mind focus on the object in front of me to notice presence. Then I quickly rushed around the house in a frantic effort to make sure each of the pets was inside and safe. Upon finding them, I whispered their names 8 times while maintaining eye contact. What I think is clear from these cases, but I try to make particularly clear from mine, is that the fear that I'm feeling is not with the present. The fear that I'm feeling is either with the past, because I may have done something wrong, or with the future, because something bad may happen. So if we turn the tables on the idea of the present is present, the idea that present is all there is and past and future exist in function of this present, from the perspective of the person with OCD, obsessive thoughts exist outside of the present. And McEwen seems to say something similar to what I claim here when she says, "My checking rituals begin through my intense distrust of my own memory and fear that I will unknowingly cause harm." So correspondingly, so far the present has been the primary temporal planes by which we have organized human experience. In moments of obsessions, it loses its priority in favor of something else that I want to explore. And one theoretical ramification of this deprioritization of the present that we can say straight away, is that movement between past and future can be established, but it does no longer need to be explained on the basis of the present anymore. In this new regime of time, the present is deprioritized, is thinned out. McEwen says that, well, I would argue that something is quite similar, not just for obsessions, but also for compulsions. Because McEwen says that during her compulsions, she is aware of 2 things at the same time. The first one is that she recognizes that her obsessive thoughts and what is happening around her, the compulsions themselves, are distinct from her usual sense of self. And this is what is usually known as ego-dystonic thoughts, which are very common in OCD, and they've been linked to OCD for a long time, I believe rightfully so. The protagonist of John Green's young adult novel Turtles All the Way Down says, and she speaks of deeply flawed line of reasoning. She does and she thinks things that she knows are illogical, and the same when I'm checking that the oven is off, I'm very much aware that what I'm doing, there's no logic behind what I'm doing. There's no logic at play there, but I still feel compelled to do it. So in this moment, I develop almost like another perspective on myself from which I assess and I question my actions in what it does feel like this extended present that I'm unable to move forward from. At the same time, McEwen also says that she must anxiously complete the routine or continue to obsess over distressing thoughts. So it seems to me that both my need and McEwen's need to complete routines, to perform actions, are dictated predominantly, if not primarily, by the necessity to escape a past or a future. Present is no longer relevant there. And I think that language can sort of help explain what I want to get at here, because language is built on a tense system that helps us shape and construct our experience of time. So I would just like to repeat to you what I probably said 5 minutes ago when I was speaking about my own experience with OCD. And I said exactly this. The thought triggering these actions is that I've left the oven on, I may die during the night, or the whole place may burn down, I may be held accountable, I may be left without a place to live in, I may have to pay an outrageous sum of money to cover for the costs. And again, the fear is that I've either said or done something that may compromise, even worse, has already compromised my position, and perhaps my relationship with that person who may want to end their friendship or working relationship with me. If you just look at the verb tenses that I've used, you will actually see that the present tense is never invoked, and the indicative mode is used very sporadically. Johann Limburg, in her memoir on OCD, The Woman Who Thought Too Much, explains that obsessive thoughts have a verb tense, which she calls the past unreal conditional tense, because she obsesses about frightful things that didn't happen but could have happened. So the attention of the obsessive-compulsive person is not on the here and now. It's on what Crip scholar Alison Kaffer would call an elsewhen. And this elsewhen is characterized by either an uncertain past or an uncertain future. In this sense, past and future are not deferred by an expanding present, but they become responsible for generating what McEwen or I feel like an expanded present. So the relation is reverted altogether. If we push this idea even further, I would want to claim that in obsessive instances where ego-dystonic thoughts are not present, so when I'm not reflecting about the reasons behind some of my actions, the person with OCD is actually not concerned with the present at all, because you're not even saying, I'm doing this and it's taking me forever now to do this. You're not thinking about that. They just need to escape from the situation. The present is thinned out, is absorbed by the categories of past and future, and it's a risk of disappearing altogether. In other words, we don't really need it anymore. The issue seems to me, how can we speak about time, and in particular about this links between past and future, through a model that doesn't invoke the present as its basis? It's very hard to do, because most models of time actually do this. They speak of the present as the point of perception and the point by which we can start thinking about how time works. Which brings me to the last part of my talk, the post-contemporary time complex. And I will take a step aside just to briefly explain what it is. So, believing that current models of how we think of time today are no longer fitting, two philosophers, Armen Avanessian and Suhail Malik, have come up with a new temporal model, where they say that time is no longer organized linearly and teleologically, so it's not moving forward, but actually time today should be described as arriving from the future instead. And they say, think about all the pre-phenomena. Think about something like preemptive strikes, where you are launching a bomb first, and only after checking if you found your enemy or not. Think about what in sci-fi novels is known as preemptive policing. So today we have CCTV, and CCTV helps you either record what has happened or see live what is happening. Preemptive policing is something that it's being developed in development in policing, and is the way of apprehending people even before they do something, but just because of what they would have done in the future. It's almost kind of fortune telling. Elena Esposito, who's somebody working in finance, speaks of derivatives used in finance as another example of a pre-phenomena. She says that with derivatives in finance, future uncertainties are preemptively brought into the present. So what happens there? To ascertain the cost of something. I'm no expert here, but my understanding is that if each share of X is being sold at $50 per share today, and you think that will go up in the future, you will probably buy a lot of them now at $55 rather than waiting and then paying $70 per share in the future. So you're guessing that something will happen, and based on that guess, that's how you shape your present. Derivatives challenge linear time exactly in doing this, preemptively bringing the future into the present in a way that determines then how the present can be constructed. As Posito says, it's not only the linear schematic of time that is crumbled, but also the very openness of the present to the future. Tomorrow, and a kind of tomorrow that we cannot ascertain, becomes today. But the present today, they say, is not just overshadowed by a future being preemptively brought into the present. There's also a different temporal dynamic going on between present and past, because they say we live in a world which is post-everything. We live in a world which is post-COVID, it's post-modern, it's post-internet. But what this stress of the post does, actually, is de-emphasizing the present itself, because the present is determined as a future in relation to a past that's been overcome. So you're not thinking of the present as the present per se, but you're thinking of the present in relation to this past, which is no longer. The postcontemporary then says that world and time in our world today is no longer explained through a linear organization between past, present, and future. If anything, the postcontemporary unfolds within a sort of like speculative present, a present that doesn't really exist. It's there, but it's determined by things other than the present itself. It's deprioritized, perhaps even drops out altogether. It doesn't stand on its own anymore. It's built on the uncertainties of what's to come or the uncertainties that have been. Now, I think it's pretty clear how this links to the experience of time in OCD, because OCD is also extremely speculative in this sense. You have obsessive thoughts and compulsive actions that derive from feelings of uncertainty about something that's either happened or that will happen in the future. So when I'm checking that the oven is off, it's because of the possibility that my house could burn down, but I don't know if that will happen or not. And language is crucial, Avanessian and Malik say, to understanding the post-contemporary time complex, this speculative new time complex. Because they say in a post-contemporary time complex, we should stop using the mode of statements, the mode of certainties, which is the indicative mode, but we should be more attuned to using, in our language, the mode of possibility instead. So they use a couple, I've used a couple of examples to explain the difference between saying the house will burn down or the house may burn down. When you say the house will burn down, you're assuming that that future event, action, and so on will happen because of conditions already existing in the present, which is not actually what is happening in the speculative post-contemporary time complex. You don't have something in the present that dictates an automatized future already. You are bringing that speculative future into the present to dictate how the present will unfold. So it's something very different. And they say how we should be able to reinstate the possibility that this future has not already been decided, is contingent on what is actually happening, and is open-ended. So we should be able to envisage a new language that allows us to think in speculative terms, as the language that we often use today does not allow us to do. When we go back to the experience of OCD, we can easily see how this aligns with the language already being used by many obsessive-compulsive individuals, in the sense that they already use the language of the may, of the modal may, of the possibility of something that we don't know, that might happen, but that somehow, in a very anachronistic way, then defines the present and how it unfolds. It parallels the way that OCD anticipates possible future, the house may burn down, or uncertain pasts, like when I'm questioning whether I've turned the oven off or not. Now, McEwen herself is afraid of causing harm. In OCD, the present becomes a precarious moment of transition between a liminal space between two uncertainties on either side, just as the post-contemporary suggests a present who's being destabilized by the past and the future. People with OCD navigate a speculative time that is shaped by doubt and possibility on both ends. Now, as a way of conclusion, well, I'm aware that what I've said was just a tentative way of bringing together two things that so far have existed separate from one another, and that many more future detailed studies are essential to understand what the practical implications of thinking about OCD this way might be. I do think that this alignment holds some promise for rethinking the experience of OCD temporality. And according to my reading, I think that OCD time is best conceptualized as a sort of speculative time complex where the present is deprioritized and is absorbed into the uncertainties of past and future. And the post-contemporary time complex may perhaps offer a compelling entry point into this destabilizing but multifaceted temporal configuration. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.